The wooden coffin looked smaller than it should have. Pine boards hastily nailed together by old Samuel, the town carpenter who'd built more coffins than cradles in his 40 years of trade. The November wind cut through Willow Creek like a rusted blade, carrying dust and dead leaves across the small cemetery perched on the hill overlooking the settlement. 23 souls had gathered, not out of love for the deceased, but out of that peculiar obligation small towns impose on their inhabitants. Martha Henley had been 19, maybe 20. Nobody knew for certain. She'd arrived in Willow Creek 6 months prior, belly already swollen with child. No husband in sight, no family name offered beyond Martha. The good Christian women had whispered behind their hands at Sunday service, while the men had simply looked away. Now she lay in that pine box, having bled out on Doc Morrison's table after laboring for 2 days to bring forth not one child, but 2. Reverend Coleman cleared his throat, his worn Bible flapping in the wind. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away," he began, his voice competing with the moaning wind. The gathered townspeople shifted uncomfortably, their eyes anywhere but on the 2 wicker baskets placed beside the grave, each containing a newborn wrapped in flour sacks, the only clean cloth Doc Morrison could find. Thomas Garrett stood at the back of the gathering, his weathered hat in his hands. At 47, he was what the townspeople called that hermit rancher, the man who lived 8 miles out on Copper Creek, who came to town only for supplies and never for socializing. His gray eyes, the color of winter sky, remained fixed on those baskets while others looked away. The twins, a boy and a girl, had survived their violent entry into the world, though Doc Morrison said it was nothing short of divine intervention. They were small, but their cries were strong enough to pierce through the cemetery's solemn atmosphere. The girl's wail rose first, followed by her brother's, creating a harmony of hunger and cold that made the assembled crowd shift even more uncomfortably. "Someone ought to quiet them," muttered Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, pulling her shawl tighter. "Someone ought to take them," replied Mrs. Walsh, the general store owner's wife, though her tone suggested that someone should definitely not be her. Reverend Coleman rushed through the final prayer, eager to conclude this uncomfortable business. As amen scattered on the wind, the crowd began to disperse with unseemly haste. Thomas noticed how they curved their paths to avoid walking too close to the baskets, as if poverty and illegitimacy might be catching diseases. "Well then," Doc Morrison said, rubbing his stubbled jaw. He hadn't slept in 3 days, and it showed. "I suppose we need to figure out what to do with these little ones." Mayor Hutchins, a portly man who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, stepped forward with the air of a man about to make a proclamation. "The town will see to it, of course. Perhaps the church. The church can barely keep a roof over its own head." Reverend Coleman interrupted, unusually sharp. "And my Mary's got 5 of our own to feed." "Well, surely one of the women folk," Hutchins began, but a collective silence from the ladies present cut him short. "Mrs." Henderson suddenly remembered urgent business. "Mrs." Walsh discovered her youngest might be taking ill. One by one, the crowd melted away like snow in spring, leaving only Doc Morrison, the gravediggers, and Thomas Garrett. The baby's cries had taken on a desperate edge. Thomas found himself moving forward, his boots crunching on the dry grass. He'd buried a child once, a daughter who'd lived only 3 hours, taking her mother with her when she left. That was 15 years past, but grief has a way of living in a man's bones, aching when the weather turns. "They need feeding," Doc Morrison said unnecessarily. "Got some goat's milk back at my office, but—" He trailed off, looking older than his 50 years. "I can't keep them." "You know I can't. I've got rounds to make, people to tend." Thomas knelt beside the baskets. The boy had dark hair like his mother, what little there was of it. The girl was fairer, with a peculiar birthmark on her left cheek shaped like a crescent moon. Their faces were red with crying, tiny fists waving at an uncaring sky. "What happens to them?" Thomas heard himself ask. Doc Morrison sighed. "County poorhouse, most likely, though Lord knows if they'll survive the journey. It's 2 days by wagon, and these November storms—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The gravediggers had begun their work, shovels biting into the hard earth. Each spadeful of dirt that landed on Martha Henley's coffin seemed to echo in the vast space between the living and the dead. Thomas thought of his own empty house, silent except for the wind through the gaps in the walls. He thought of 15 years of setting one plate at the table, of talking to horses because they were the only creatures that would listen. "I'll take them." The words surprised him as much as they did Doc Morrison. The doctor's eyebrows rose nearly to his receding hairline. "Tom, you don't know the first thing about caring for infants, and two of them. At that, you'd need—" "I know what I'd need." Thomas's voice was steady now, decisive. "Goat's milk, clean cloth for diapers, someone to show me how to mix the feeding formula. Mrs. Garcia, Miguel's wife, she's got 8 children. She'd know." "This isn't a decision to make lightly," Doc Morrison warned, but something in his eyes suggested relief. "Once you take them, the town will expect you to keep them. There's no changing your mind come spring." Thomas picked up the first basket, the girl. She weighed nothing at all, light as prairie grass. Her crying stuttered to a stop as the motion soothed her. Then he managed the boy in his other arm, balancing both baskets with the practiced ease of a man who'd carried newborn calves and foals. "I've got an empty house and 40 head of cattle," he said simply. "That's more than their mother had, and more than the poor house would give them." Doc Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come by my office. I'll give you what supplies I have." He paused. "Tom, why, after all these years alone? Why now?" Thomas looked down at the infants. The boy had stopped crying too, his dark eyes trying to focus on this new face above him. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have nobody claim you," he said quietly. "My parents died when I was 7. Spent 3 years being passed from family to family, each one finding reasons why they couldn't keep me. Finally ran away. Made my own way." He shifted the baskets slightly, testing their weight. "These two won't know that feeling. Not if I can help it." The gravediggers had finished their work. A mound of fresh earth marked where Martha Henley would rest. No headstone yet. That would have to wait until someone could pay Samuel to carve one. The other graves stretched out in ragged rows, some marked, some forgotten, all equal under the endless Montana sky. As Thomas turned to leave, carrying his unexpected burden, he noticed a piece of paper tucked into the girl's blanket. He'd look at it later, probably a note from Martha, maybe the only clue to where she'd come from. For now, he had more pressing concerns. The wind was picking up, and snow would come soon. 8 miles to home had never seemed so far. Behind him, Willow Creek went about its business. The saloon would open in an hour. Mrs. Walsh would count her inventory. Mayor Hutchins would calculate his cattle profits. Life would continue as it always had, comfortable in its routines and willful blindness. But for Thomas Garrett, walking toward his wagon with 2 orphaned souls in his arms, everything had changed. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 15 years would have to make room for something else. Responsibility, purpose, perhaps even love. The babies made soft sounds now, no longer crying, as if they sensed that someone, at last, had chosen not to walk away. The road home stretched before him, rutted and uncertain, but for the first time in longer than he could remember. Thomas Garrett didn't mind the journey. The first night nearly broke him. Thomas had managed the 8 miles home well enough, stopping twice to rewrap the babies when they fussed. Mrs. Garcia had been a godsend. Miguel's wife had taken one look at the situation and immediately set about teaching him the basics. "Hold the bottle like this, Senor Tom, at an angle so they don't swallow air." Her weathered hands had guided his clumsy ones. "Change them when they cry. Feed them every 2 hours. Keep them warm but not too warm." But now, at 2 in the morning, with both infants screaming and the fire dying in the hearth, Thomas wondered what madness had possessed him. The boy, he'd have to name them soon, had taken only half his bottle before spitting up. The girl wouldn't take hers at all, turning her tiny head away each time he tried. "Please," he found himself whispering to her. "Please, little one, You need to eat." The cabin felt different with them in it. For 15 years, it had been a place of profound silence, broken only by the settling of logs and the scurrying of mice. Now it vibrated with life, desperate, demanding life that required more of him than he'd given to anything since Sarah died. Sarah. He tried not to think of her on most days, but tonight her absence felt fresh as a new wound. She would have known what to do. She'd grown up the eldest of 7, had helped birth and raise most of her siblings. "Someday," she'd told him, her hand on her swelling belly, "this house will ring with children's laughter." Instead, it had rung with her screams as she labored, then with silence when both she and their daughter left him behind. Thomas shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. The girl was still refusing the bottle. He remembered something Mrs. Garcia had said about skin contact sometimes calming babies. Feeling foolish, but desperate, he unbuttoned his shirt and laid the infant against his chest, covering them both with a blanket. The effect was immediate. She stopped crying, her tiny body relaxing against him. After a moment, she even took the bottle, sucking weakly but steadily. The boy, perhaps sensing his sister's calm, quieted as well. "There now," Thomas murmured, barely daring to breathe. "That's better." He fed them in turns, the girl against his chest, then the boy. By the time both were satisfied, gray dawn light was seeping through the windows. His back ached from sitting upright in the chair, afraid to move and disturb them, but they were quiet, fed, and breathing steadily. As the sun rose fully, Thomas finally felt safe enough to lay them in the wooden crate he'd lined with blankets, a poor substitute for proper cradles, but it would have to do. He added wood to the fire, checked that they were warm enough, then allowed himself to really look at the paper he'd found tucked in with the girl. It wasn't a note from Martha. It was a page torn from a Bible. Exodus, the story of Moses in the bulrushes. In the margin, in pencil so faint he could barely read it, someone had written, "Ruth and Samuel Henley, born November 12, 1871. God preserve them." Ruth and Samuel. They had names. Thomas sank into his chair, exhaustion pulling at him like quicksand. Through the window, he could see his cattle moving slowly through the near pasture, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. They'd need feeding soon. The horses, too. And there was fence to mend on the south border, wood to split for the coming winter. 100 tasks that made up the rhythm of his solitary life. But first, sleep, just an hour, maybe 2. He woke to crying again. The sun had moved significantly. He'd slept nearly 4 hours. Guilt stabbed at him as he struggled up, muscles protesting. Both babies were wailing, their faces red with frustration. I'm sorry," he muttered, heating the goat's milk as quickly as he could. His hands shook with fatigue as he prepared the bottles. How did women do this? How did anyone do this? As he fed Samuel, the boy was definitely the more demanding of the two memories surfaced unbidden. The tiny grave on the hillside, marked with a stone he'd carved himself. Elizabeth Garrett, beloved daughter, 1856. Next to it, a larger stone, Sarah Garrett, beloved wife, 1,831 to 1,856 inches. He'd been 32 when he lost them, young enough to remarry. Everyone said, young enough to try again. But he'd come out here instead, to this land that demanded everything and forgave nothing. He'd built his life around the absence of love, made peace with loneliness, found a kind of harsh contentment in the cycles of seasons and cattle. Now these two small souls had shattered that carefully constructed solitude. The second night was worse. Samuel developed a cough that terrified Thomas, each tiny hack sounding like approaching death. He held the boy upright, patting his back the way Mrs. Garcia had shown him, but the cough persisted. Ruth fussed constantly, seeming to sense her brother's distress. By the third night, Thomas was hallucinating from lack of sleep. He saw Sarah in the corner of the room, smiling that gentle smile of hers. "You're doing fine," she seemed to say. "They just need you to not give up." "I don't know how," he told the apparition. "I don't know how to do this." But he kept going. When Samuel's cough finally eased on the 4th day, Thomas nearly wept with relief. When Ruth grabbed his finger while feeding, her grip surprisingly strong, something shifted in his chest, a loosening of bands he hadn't realized were there. Slowly, painfully, they developed a rhythm. Thomas learned to doze while they slept, to wake at their first stirring. He rigged a sling from an old shirt so he could carry one while feeding the other. He discovered that Ruth liked to be rocked side to side, while Samuel preferred up and down. He learned the different cries: hunger, discomfort, loneliness, fear. Miguel stopped by on the 5th day, bringing fresh goat's milk and news from town. "They're taking bets," Miguel said, his dark eyes serious. "How long before you bring them back?" "What are the odds?" Thomas asked, too tired to be properly offended. "Week's the favorite, though Doc Morrison put money on you keeping them." Thomas looked at the babies, sleeping peacefully for once in their makeshift cradle. Samuel's dark hair stuck up at odd angles. Ruth's birthmark seemed more prominent now, a perfect crescent moon that made her look like she was always about to smile. "Doc's going to win that bet," Thomas said quietly. Miguel nodded, seeming unsurprised. "My Maria says to tell you you're doing good. She also sent these." He produced 2 small knitted blankets, one blue, one pink. "And she says bring them by when you're ready. The children want to meet them." After Miguel left, Thomas sat in the deepening twilight, a baby in each arm. They were awake but quiet, their eyes trying to focus on his face. Did they know their mother was gone? Did they understand that they'd been passed over, unwanted, until a broken-down rancher with more grief than sense decided to claim them? "I'm not your father," he told them softly. "I'm just a man who knows what it's like to be alone. But I promise you this. You'll never wonder if someone will keep you. You'll never be afraid that tomorrow you'll be sent away." Ruth made a small sound, almost like agreement. Samuel yawned, his entire face scrunching with the effort. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and silent. The cattle would need extra feed tomorrow. The roof leaked in the back bedroom. He'd need to fix that before the heavy snows came. There was so much to do, so much he didn't know. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to sit by the fire with these 2 small lives in his arms. They'd survived the first week. They'd survive the next. And somewhere in the surviving, maybe they'd become what Sarah had always dreamed of, a family. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 15 years was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Not absence, but possibility. Not emptiness, but space waiting to be filled. Thomas Garrett, who had made himself into an island, was learning to be a harbor instead. The woman arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the burial. Thomas first saw her through the frost-covered window, a figure in black stepping down from a hired wagon, her movements careful and deliberate on the icy ground. Something in his chest tightened with premonition. Ruth was sleeping in her cradle, a proper one now, carved by Samuel the carpenter in exchange for a side of beef. Little Samuel was awake in Thomas's arms, gripping his finger with that surprising baby strength. The boy had filled out in these 3 weeks, his cheeks rounding, his dark eyes growing more alert each day. The knock, when it came, was sharp and authoritative. "Mr. Garrett?" The woman's voice carried the clipped tones of Eastern education. She was perhaps 35, with steel-gray eyes and auburn hair pulled back severely beneath her traveling bonnet. "My name is Mrs. Constance Hartwell. I believe you have my sister's children." Thomas felt the words like a physical blow. Behind him, Ruth stirred and began to fuss. "Your sister?" he managed. "Martha Henley." Her lips pursed as she said the name. "Though she left Baltimore as Martha Hartwell. I've come to collect the twins. Perhaps you should come in," Thomas said, though every instinct screamed against it. He stepped aside, still holding Samuel protectively. Mrs. Hartwell entered, her sharp gaze taking in every detail of the cabin, the rough-hewn furniture, the makeshift nursery corner, the drying diapers strung by the fire. Her nose wrinkled slightly. "I see," she said, though what she saw, she didn't elaborate. "I apologize for the delay in arriving. Word of Martha's situation. Took time to reach Baltimore. Then there was the matter of arranging travel. Winter journeys are so treacherous." Ruth's fussing had become full crying. Thomas shifted Samuel to one arm and picked her up with the other, bouncing slightly to soothe her. "Mrs." Hartwell watched this with an unreadable expression. "They seem healthy enough," she conceded. "I suppose I should thank you for keeping them alive." "They're more than alive," Thomas said, hearing the edge in his own voice. "They're thriving." "Yes, well," she removed her gloves with precise movements. "I've brought documentation, letters from Martha over the years, proof of our family connection. My husband, Mr. Hartwell, is in shipping, quite successful, and I are prepared to give them a proper home, education, society, advantages they could never have here." She produced a leather folder from her traveling bag, laying out papers on Thomas's rough table. He recognized Martha's handwriting from the Bible page, saw the name Hartwell repeated throughout the correspondence. "You didn't come to the funeral," Thomas said quietly. "Mrs." Hartwell's composure cracked slightly. We didn't know. As I said, word traveled slowly. Martha left Baltimore 2 years ago after bringing shame upon the family. We lost track of her. She died alone, in pain, calling for someone named James." Her husband? Or rather, the man who claimed to be her husband. Bitterness colored Mrs. Hartwell's tone. A fortune hunter who disappeared the moment he learned her inheritance was tied up in trust until her 21st birthday. She followed him west like a fool. Thomas looked down at the twins. Samuel had fallen asleep, his tiny mouth making sucking motions in his dreams. Ruth had quieted, staring up at him with those eyes that were just beginning to show flecks of green. "They have names," he said. "Ruth and Samuel. She wrote them in a Bible before she died. Family names." "Mrs." Hartwell said with satisfaction. "Our grandparents. You see, she never forgot where she belonged, despite everything." Through the window, Thomas could see his cattle huddled against the wind. Miguel would be by later to help with the feeding. He'd been coming every few days, bringing his oldest boys to help with the ranch work Thomas had been neglecting. "I'll need a day or two to gather their things," he heard himself say. "Of course, I'm staying at the hotel in town. We can complete the legal transfer there. I've already spoken with Mayor Hutchins. He agrees that blood family has the stronger claim." After she left, Thomas sat for a long time, still holding both babies. The cabin felt colder, though the fire burned just as bright. He thought of the nights he'd walked the floor with them, the terrifying moment when Samuel had choked on his milk, and Thomas had to turn him upside down, patting frantically until the baby coughed and breathed again. He thought of Ruth's first real smile, just 2 days ago, a toothless grin that had made his heart turn over. "She's your blood," he told them. "She can give you things I can't, real family, money, education, a name that means something in society." But even as he said it, he was remembering his own childhood, the aunt who'd taken him in after his parents died, who'd fed him and clothed him but never once held him when he cried, the cousin who'd inherited him next, who'd made it clear he was a burden to be born, the final family who'd used him for farm labor while telling everyone how charitable they were to take in an orphan. That night, Thomas barely slept. He held the babies close, memorizing the weight of them, the sound of their breathing, the way Ruth always grabbed for his beard when she nursed from her bottle. Near dawn, he made his decision. He rode to town at first light, leaving the twins with Mrs. Garcia. Miguel's wife had taken one look at his face and asked no questions, just gathered the babies with gentle hands. Thomas found Josiah Bell in his law office above the bank. The elderly lawyer listened without interruption as Thomas laid out his case. "She abandoned them," Thomas said, "left when her sister needed her most. I'm the one who took them from that graveyard. I'm the one who's fed them every 2 hours for 3 weeks. The law favors blood relatives, Josiah said carefully. You know that, Tom. Then I'll adopt them. Make it legal. A single man, a rancher living alone, the judge won't like it. The judge didn't stand by that grave. The judge didn't see everyone walk away. Josiah leaned back, studying Thomas over his spectacles. You'd fight for them. Truly. They're mine, Thomas said simply. Maybe not by blood, but by choice, by right of being the only one who stayed. The hearing was set for the next morning. Word had spread quickly through Willow Creek. The hermit rancher was challenging Mrs. Hartwell's claim. Bets were placed. Gossip flew. Most assumed Thomas would lose. The courthouse was packed. Judge Frederick Mason, brought in from the county seat, was known for his strict interpretation of law. Mrs. Hartwell sat with her attorney from Denver. Her documentation spread before her. Thomas sat alone. His one piece of evidence, the torn Bible page with Martha's handwriting. The law's clear, Mrs. Hartwell's attorney argued. Blood relation takes precedence. Mrs. Hartwell is prepared to provide these children with every advantage, private tutors, good society, inheritance prospects. What can Mr. Garrett offer? A leaking cabin and a herd of cattle. When Thomas's turn came, he stood slowly. He wasn't a man of words, never had been, but he thought of Ruth and Samuel, waiting at the Garcia house, and found his voice. I can offer them certainty, he said. They'll never wonder if they're wanted, never be sent away because they're inconvenient. I've buried a daughter. Your Honor, I know what it means to lose a child. These two won't ever doubt they're chosen, because I chose them when everyone else walked away. Sentiment, Mrs. Hartwell's attorney scoffed. The law doesn't deal in sentiment. Judge Mason was silent for a long moment. Then, Mr. Garrett, are you prepared for the responsibility? 2 infants, raised alone. I haven't been alone since I took them home. The Garcia family helps. Doc Morrison checks on them. Even people who wanted nothing to do with them at the cemetery have been leaving food at my door. These children have made me part of the town in a way I never was before. And you, Mrs. Hartwell. The judge turned to her. Why did you not come sooner? We had to arrange matters. My husband needed convincing. Your husband doesn't know you're here. Thomas interrupted. Everyone turned to stare. I asked around. You told him you were visiting a sick friend in Chicago. You're planning to surprise him with the babies. Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed. That's not... How dare you? Is this true? Judge Mason asked sharply. Her silence was answer enough. The judge's decision came swift and unexpected. While blood relation typically takes precedence, the welfare of the children must be paramount. These infants have been abandoned once by their blood family. I will not see them abandoned again, Mr. Garrett has demonstrated commitment and community support. The children will remain with him. The courtroom erupted. Mrs. Hartwell shot to her feet. Her composure shattered. This is irregular. I'll appeal. That is your right, Judge Mason said calmly. But for now, my decision stands. Outside the courthouse, Thomas found his knees shaking. Doc Morrison clapped him on the back. Well done, Tom. Sarah would be proud. Thomas looked toward the Garcia house, where his children waited. His children. The word still felt foreign, but right. Mrs. Hartwell intercepted him on the street. This isn't over, she said, but the fire had gone out of her voice. You could visit them, Thomas offered quietly. Tell them about their mother. They should know where they came from. She looked at him for a long moment. This rough rancher who'd fought for her sister's children. Perhaps, she said finally. Perhaps I will. She left town that afternoon. Thomas never saw her again. Though a package arrived every Christmas for the next 10 years, children's books, fine clothes, small treasures from the East. They always came with the same card. For Ruth and Samuel, from their Aunt Constance. But that was still to come. For now. Thomas gathered his children from the Garcia house, loaded them into his wagon, and headed home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Ruth grabbed his beard when he lifted her, and Samuel yawned enormously. "Let's go home." Thomas told them, "We've got cattle to feed and a life to build." The road stretched before them, no longer empty but full of possibility. They were a family now, not by blood but by choice, and in the wild lands of Montana. Sometimes that was the strongest bond of all. The February wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of the small courthouse. Thomas sat rigid on the hard wooden bench, Ruth on his lap and Samuel in a basket beside him. At 4 months old, the twins had grown sturdy and alert, their eyes tracking movement, their small hands grasping at the world around them. Ruth's moon-shaped birthmark had faded to a pale pink, while Samuel's dark hair had grown thick and unruly. Judge Mason, the same who had ruled in Thomas's favor just 2 months prior, now sat with a decidedly less sympathetic expression. Before him stood Mrs. Hartwell, returned from Baltimore with reinforcements, a sharp-faced attorney from Denver and a thick folder of new documentation. "Your Honor," the attorney, Mr. Pemberton, began in a voice smooth as oil. "We have uncovered information that drastically alters this case. Mrs. Martha Henley, née Hartwell, left behind significant debts. As her legal next of kin, my client has graciously agreed to assume these obligations, but only if she is granted custody of the children who are, technically, part of their mother's estate." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Estate? They're children, not property. "Mr. Garrett, you will remain silent unless addressed," Judge Mason warned. Though his own expression showed distaste, Pemberton continued, producing document after document. $300 owed to a boarding house in St. Louis, $75 to a doctor in Kansas City, $40 to a seamstress in Denver. The list continues. Nearly $600 in total. Debts incurred while she was running from the man who abandoned her, Thomas said, unable to keep silent. Trying to survive while carrying twins. Regardless of the circumstances, Pemberton said smoothly. The debts are real and legally binding. Under territorial law, the children can be considered assets to offset these obligations. My client is prepared to pay all debts in exchange for custody. Mrs. Hartwell sat perfectly composed, but Thomas caught something in her eyes. Was it satisfaction? Or something else? "This is highly irregular," Judge Mason said, frowning as he reviewed the papers. "Children are not chattel to be bartered." "Of course not, Your Honor," Pemberton agreed. "But consider the alternative. If Mr. Garrett wishes to maintain custody, he becomes responsible for these debts. Can a simple rancher afford $600? I think not. The children would be better served." "I'll pay it." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Everyone turned to stare at Thomas. "I'll pay every cent," he repeated, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. $600 was more than he'd make in 2 years, even with good cattle prices. Pemberton recovered first, his smile sharp. "With what collateral?" "Mr. Garrett, your ranch is already mortgaged. Your cattle herd is modest at best, unless you have hidden wealth." Thomas's mind raced. The ranch was all he had, built with his own hands after Sarah died. 40 head of cattle, 6 horses, the cabin, and 60 acres of decent grazing land. Not much, but it was his life's work. "I need time," he said. 30 days to arrange the funds. The children's welfare shouldn't wait for your financial scrambling." Mrs. Hartwell spoke for the first time. "They need stability now." Ruth chose that moment to start fussing. Thomas shifted her automatically, producing a bottle from the bag Miguel's wife had packed. The practiced ease of the motion wasn't lost on the judge. 2 weeks, Judge Mason ruled. "Mr. Garrett has 2 weeks to produce the funds or arrange acceptable payment. The children remain with him during this time. Court is adjourned." Outside, the February cold bit deep. Thomas bundled the twins carefully, his mind already calculating. The cattle might bring $400 if he sold them all. But then how would he support the children? The horses were worth maybe 100, but he needed them for work. The land itself. Mr. Garrett. He turned to find Mrs. Hartwell approaching, her expensive boots clicking on the frozen boardwalk. "This doesn't have to be difficult," she said, pulling her fur-trimmed cloak tighter. "I'm not a monster. I can see you care for them, but be practical. What future can you offer? I can give them everything: education, society, opportunities. All you can give them is poverty and isolation. I can give them love," Thomas said quietly. "Love doesn't pay debts or put food on the table." Her voice softened slightly. "I lost my sister to romantic foolishness. I won't lose her children to prideful stubbornness. Accept the inevitable. Mr. Garrett, let them go." That night, Thomas sat by the fire long after the twins had fallen asleep. The arithmetic was brutal and unchanging. Even if he sold everything, he'd still be short. And then what? How would he feed them with no cattle, no horses, no land? A soft knock interrupted his desperate calculations. Doc Morrison entered, followed by Miguel and, surprisingly, Josiah Bell. "Heard about the hearing," Doc said without preamble. "How much do you need?" $600 in 2 weeks. The impossibility of it sat heavy in the room. "I can lend you 50, Doc said. "It's my emergency fund, but this qualifies." "I have 30 saved," Miguel added. "Was going to buy a new plow, but it can wait." Thomas's throat tightened. "I can't take your money, either of you." "You're not taking," Josiah said firmly. "You're borrowing. There's a difference. I've drawn up promissory notes. You'll pay us back over time, with fair interest, even with your generosity. That's only $80. "Then we'll find more," Doc said. "This town owes you something. Tom, you took those babies when everyone else turned away. Time we remembered that." Over the next days, Thomas watched in amazement as Willow Creek transformed. The same people who'd walked away from the cemetery began stopping by the ranch. Mrs. Walsh from the general store brought $20. "For the credit you never use," she said briskly. Reverend Coleman contributed $25 from the church fund. "For the family that never asks for help," he explained. But it wasn't enough. By the 10th day, they'd raised $320. Thomas had found a buyer for half his cattle, another $150, still $130 short. That night, a stranger appeared at Thomas's door. He was well-dressed but travel-worn, with the bearing of a man used to authority. "Mr. Garrett? My name is James Worthington." Thomas's blood ran cold. James, the name Martha had called out as she died. "I understand you've taken in my children," the man continued. "Martha's children," Thomas corrected sharply. "Yes." Worthington's face showed genuine grief. "I only just learned of her death. I've been searching for her for months. My family, they kept her letters from me, told her I'd abandoned her. By the time I discovered their deception, she'd vanished." Thomas studied the man, younger than expected, perhaps 25, with a soft look of Eastern privilege but something genuine in his eyes. "Why should I believe you?" Worthington produced a packet of letters. Martha's handwriting. Love letters never sent. "I found these in her room in St. Louis. She thought I'd betrayed her. But I loved her. I want to see our children." Thomas led him to where the twins slept. Worthington's face crumbled at the sight of them. "They have her nose," he whispered. "Both of them." "There's a problem." Thomas explained about the debts, the custody battle, the impossible deadline. Worthington listened in growing anger. "Constance, of course. She always hated Martha's independence." He pulled out a leather wallet. "How much do you need?" "I can't take your money." "You're not. I'm paying my children's debts. It's the least I can do." He counted out $200 in gold certificates. "This should cover what you're missing, plus some extra for their care." "What about custody? Don't you want—" "I want them safe and loved." Worthington interrupted. "I can see they have that with you. I forfeited my rights when I failed to find their mother in time. But perhaps I could visit, be part of their lives somehow." Thomas thought of his own childhood, the absence of family beyond those who grudgingly took him in. They should know their father. When they're older. The hearing 2 days later was brief. Thomas placed the full payment on the judge's desk, $600 in mixed bills and gold. Pemberton looked stunned. Mrs. Hartwell's composure finally cracked completely. "Where did you? This is impossible." "The community rallied," Thomas said simply. "And their father contributed." "Their father is dead." "Mrs. Hartwell snapped. "No, madam. I'm very much alive." James Worthington entered the courtroom with perfect timing. "Hello, Constance. We need to discuss your family's role in Martha's tragedy." What followed was pandemonium. Accusations flew. Old family secrets spilled into the open. Through it all, Thomas held the twins, who slept peacefully despite the chaos. Finally, Judge Mason hammered for order. "Enough. The debts are paid. Mr. Garrett retains custody. Mr. Worthington. You may petition for visitation rights through proper channels. Mrs. Hartwell, I suggest you return to Baltimore before more unfortunate truths emerge. Court is dismissed." That evening, Thomas stood on his porch, watching the sun set over his diminished but intact ranch. The twins lay in their cradles inside, fed and content. His neighbors had saved him. The father he'd never expected had appeared like a miracle, and the children were still his. Doc Morrison's wagon appeared on the road, followed by several others. Half the town, it seemed, was coming to celebrate. Mrs. Garcia had cooking pots. Miguel brought his fiddle, and even stern Mrs. Walsh carried what looked suspiciously like a cake. "Thought we'd have a proper welcome party," Doc called out, "for Willow Creek's newest official family." As the evening filled with music and laughter, Thomas realized something had shifted. He'd spent 15 years as an island, self-sufficient and alone. But these two small souls had built a bridge he hadn't known he needed. He wasn't just Thomas Garrett anymore, the hermit rancher. He was Tom, father of twins, member of a community, part of something larger than his own grief. Ruth and Samuel had given him more than he'd given them. They'd given him a reason to let the world back in. The debt was paid, but what he owed them for bringing him back to life could never be measured in dollars. That was a debt he'd spent his lifetime gladly repaying. One bottle, one sleepless night, one small miracle at a time. The man arrived with the spring thaw, when Ruth and Samuel were just beginning to pull themselves up on furniture and babble their first almost words. Thomas first noticed him in town, a well-dressed stranger asking questions at the general store, his Eastern accent marking him as decidedly not local. Garrett children, Thomas overheard as he loaded supplies. Twin babies taken in by a rancher. Mrs. Walsh, to her credit, suddenly became very busy with her ledgers. "Can't say I know anything about that," she said, though everyone in Willow Creek knew everything about Thomas and the twins. Thomas finished his business quickly, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. He'd thought they were done with people trying to claim the children. The past months had been peaceful. James Worthington visited monthly, always respectful of boundaries, slowly building a relationship with his offspring, Mrs. Hartwell had vanished back to Baltimore. Life had found a rhythm. But now this. The stranger appeared at the ranch 3 days later. Thomas saw him coming from a distance, a lone rider on an expensive horse, picking his way carefully along the muddy road. By the time he arrived, Thomas was waiting on the porch, rifle conspicuously displayed against the rail. "Mr. Garrett?" The man dismounted with practiced ease. He was perhaps 40, with cold gray eyes and the build of someone who hired others to do his physical labor. "My name is Elias Blackwood. I represent certain interests in St. Louis. Not interested in whatever you're selling," Thomas said flatly. Blackwood smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not selling anything, Mr. Garrett. I'm collecting. You see, Miss Martha Henley owed my employer a significant sum of money. Those debts were paid. Every cent. Ah, but you paid the legitimate debts. the ones recorded in proper establishments. Blackwood produced a leather folder. My employer operated a private lending establishment. Miss Henley borrowed $200 8 months before her unfortunate demise, with interest compounded monthly at 20%. The current balance is $430. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. 20% monthly interest, usury. Plain and simple. You're a loan shark. Such crude terms. My employer prefers private financier. The debt is real. Mr. Garrett. And legally binding. Here's Miss Henley's signature. The document looked authentic. Martha's desperate signature at the bottom. Thomas could imagine her, pregnant and alone, turning to anyone who would help. The children aren't responsible for their mother's debts. Thomas said, "Perhaps not. But you assumed responsibility when you took them in. And if you can't pay..." Blackwood's smile widened. "Well, my employer is a reasonable man. The children themselves would clear the debt. There's always demand for healthy infants in certain circles. Childless couples who don't ask questions about origins." Thomas's hand moved toward the rifle, but Blackwood raised a cautioning finger. Now, I'm merely explaining options. You have 30 days to consider. My employer would prefer cash, but he's willing to be flexible." After Blackwood left, Thomas sat in the kitchen, watching Ruth and Samuel play on a blanket. Samuel was trying to crawl toward a wooden horse Miguel had carved, while Ruth seemed content to bang a spoon against a pot. Neither had any idea that someone was trying to sell them like livestock. That evening, Thomas rode to town and found Josiah Bell still in his office. "Usury is illegal," the lawyer said after reviewing the document. "But proving it is another matter. These men operate in shadows. And if they have Martha's genuine signature, there must be something we can do." Josiah hesitated. "There might be, but it would require finding out who this employer is, documenting their illegal practices. Dangerous work. I'll do whatever it takes." Over the next week, Thomas played detective with grim determination. Blackwood was staying at the hotel, spending his days gambling and his nights at the saloon. Thomas enlisted help from unexpected quarters, the saloon girls, who heard everything, the stable boys, who knew everyone's business, even the town drunk, who saw more than people realized. Slowly, a picture emerged. The employer was Marcus Thornton, a St. Louis businessman with legitimate enterprises that fronted for loan sharking, illegal gambling, and worse. He had a network of collectors like Blackwood, and a reputation for getting what he was owed. One way or another, he's connected. Doc Morrison warned when Thomas shared what he'd learned. "Judges, lawmen, politicians. You can't fight him in court. Then I'll fight him another way. Tom, be sensible. Maybe we can raise the money again." "No." Thomas's voice was firm. "I won't let the town bankrupt itself for my family. And I won't teach Ruth and Samuel that you can buy your way out of evil. Sometimes you have to stand." James Worthington arrived for his monthly visit to find Thomas cleaning rifles and checking ammunition. "Planning a war?" he asked lightly, then sobered as Thomas explained, "My God, they're trying to sell my children. Not if I can help it. I have money. This isn't about money anymore." Thomas met the younger man's eyes. "This is about making sure they never come back. Your money didn't protect Martha from these people. It won't protect Ruth and Samuel." Worthington was quiet for a moment. "Then what can I do? You know people in St. Louis, legitimate businessmen. Find out everything you can about Marcus Thornton. Every enemy he's made, every law he's broken. Information is ammunition." As the deadline approached, Thomas prepared. He reinforced the cabin's defenses, stocked ammunition, arranged for the twins to stay with the Garcias if things went badly, but he also did something else. He wrote letters to the territorial governor, to the federal marshal's office, to newspapers in St. Louis and Denver. He documented everything, included affidavits from townspeople, copied the usurious contract. "You're painting a target on your back," Miguel warned. "Better on mine than on theirs," Thomas replied, watching Ruth take her first wobbling steps between furniture. Blackwood returned exactly 30 days later, this time with 2 companions, hard men with scarred hands and empty eyes. "Mr. Garrett," Blackwood called from the yard. "Have you considered our offer?" Thomas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. What Blackwood didn't know was that half of Willow Creek was positioned around the property. Miguel and his brothers in the barn, Doc Morrison and Reverend Coleman behind the woodshed, even Mrs. Walsh's nephew on the roof with a hunting rifle. "I have," Thomas said calmly. "The answer is no." "That's unfortunate." Blackwood's veneer of civility cracked. "Mr. Thornton doesn't accept no as an answer. Then Mr. Thornton will have to learn disappointment." One of the hard men reached for his gun. Before he could clear leather, a shot rang out. Not from Thomas, but from the barn. The man's hat flew off, and he froze. "That was a warning," Miguel called out. Suddenly, Blackwood and his men realized they were surrounded. Every window, every corner held an armed citizen of Willow Creek. "You wouldn't dare," Blackwood snarled. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Thomas said. "A parasite who preys on desperate women and orphaned children. But here's what you don't know. Every newspaper from here to Chicago has copies of your employer's practices. The federal marshals have been notified. The governor is very interested in illegal lending operations in the territory." It was partly bluff. Thomas had no idea if his letters had even been received, but Blackwood didn't know that. "Even if you kill us all," Thomas continued, "you've already lost. Too many people know. Too many people are watching. Your employer's shadow business only works in darkness. We've dragged it into the light." Blackwood's face had gone pale. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." A new voice spoke from the road. Federal Marshal William Brennan rode up with 4 deputies. "Elias Blackwood, you're under arrest for usury, attempted kidnapping, and conspiracy to traffic children." The arrest was swift and efficient. As Blackwood was led away in irons, he shot Thomas a look of pure hatred. "Thornton has a long memory. So do I," Thomas replied, later, as the town celebrated in his yard. Thomas held his children close. Ruth was walking everywhere now. Samuel not far behind. They had no idea how close they'd come to being sold like cattle, and God willing, they never would. Marshal Brennan pulled Thomas aside. "Your letters started quite the investigation. Thornton's operation is crumbling. You did a brave thing." "I did what any father would do." "No," Brennan corrected. "You did what a father should do. There's a difference." As night fell and the celebration wound down, Thomas sat on his porch with the twins sleeping in his arms. The threat was gone, but he knew there would be others. The world was full of people who saw orphans as opportunities, who viewed the vulnerable as prey. But Ruth and Samuel wouldn't face that world alone. They had him. They had this community. They had the fierce love of people who chose to stand between them and harm. "You're safe," he whispered to them. "You'll always be safe, I promise." In the distance, coyotes howled at the rising moon, but the sound didn't frighten him anymore. There were worse predators than coyotes in the world, and he'd faced them down. His children slept peacefully, unaware of the battle fought for their freedom, knowing only that they were held, they were loved, they were home. The man who'd once chosen isolation had become a fortress, and within those walls, 2 small souls could grow unafraid, knowing that some things, family, love, the right to simply exist, were worth any fight. The decision came to Thomas in the depths of night, with autumn rain hammering against the windows and both children burning with fever. Doc Morrison had been by twice that day, his face grave as he examined the twins. "It's the grip," he'd said. "Going around the whole territory. Most children recover, but..." He hadn't needed to finish. Everyone knew the statistics. Everyone knew the small graves that dotted every cemetery. Now, at 3 a.m, Thomas held Ruth while she whimpered in fitful sleep, her small body radiating heat like a stove. Samuel lay in his crib, too weak even to cry. The medicine Doc had left seemed to do little good. Through his exhaustion, Thomas heard it, horses approaching, multiple riders, moving with purpose despite the storm. His blood ran cold. After the incident with Thornton's men 6 months ago, he'd hoped for peace. The federal investigation had indeed crumbled Thornton's operation. But men like that had long reaches and longer memories. Thomas laid Ruth gently in her crib and reached for his rifle. The riders stopped just outside the light from his windows. A voice called out, "Cultured and cold. Mr. Garrett, we need to discuss your debt to Mr. Thornton. Thornton's in federal prison." Thomas called back, "Indeed, but his associates remain free, and they've acquired his interests, including certain outstanding debts." Through the rain, Thomas could make out 4 figures, well-armed, patient, professional. "The children are sick. Whatever business you have can wait." "I'm afraid not." The speaker dismounted, stepping just into the light. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that would be handsome if not for the emptiness in his eyes. "My name is Jonathan Cross, Mr. Thornton's nephew. You cost my uncle everything. His business, his freedom, his reputation. Your uncle was a criminal who preyed on desperate people. My uncle was a businessman who provided services others wouldn't." Cross's voice remained conversational, which somehow made it worse. "But that's history. What matters now is the debt, $430, plus interest for 6 months, plus damages for our losses due to your interference. Call it an even $2,000. Samuel coughed weakly from his crib. Ruth stirred, whimpering. Thomas's mind raced. $2,000 might as well be $2 million. "I don't have that kind of money." "Of course not. But you have other assets. The children. For instance, there are still buyers." "Never." The word came out as a growl. "Then the ranch. Sign it over. Take the children. Leave the territory. You have until dawn to decide." They withdrew into the darkness. But Thomas knew they hadn't gone far. He could see the glow of their camp near the road, close enough to watch, far enough to avoid easy gunfire. Thomas returned to the children. Ruth's fever seemed worse. Samuel's breathing was labored. They needed a doctor's constant care, medicine he couldn't afford. A chance to fight this illness without the stress of flight. He made his choice, moving quickly but quietly. Thomas began to pack. Not everything, that would take too long. Just essentials, the children's things, his wife's Bible, the small stash of money he'd saved, a photograph of Sarah, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The hardest part was preparing the children. He bundled them carefully, layering blankets despite their fever. Ruth protested weakly as he lifted her. "Papa." It was one of her few words, learned just last month. "Shh, little moon," he whispered, using his pet name for her. "We're going on an adventure." He'd prepared for this possibility. In the month since Thornton's arrest, he'd hidden supplies in an old line shack 10 miles into the mountains. It wasn't much, some food, blankets, ammunition, but it would be a start. The barn was the risky part. He'd have to saddle Sarah's pride, his most reliable horse, and rig a travois for the children, all without alerting the watchers. The rain helped, masking sounds. Thomas worked by touch more than sight, years of experience guiding his hands. The horse, sensing urgency, stayed unusually quiet. Just before dawn, as the sky began to lighten, Thomas made his move. He led the horse out the back of the barn, away from where Cross's men waited. The travois, cushioned with every blanket he could spare, carried the twins. They were so still, so quiet. It terrified him. They'd made it perhaps a mile when he heard the shouts behind him. They'd discovered his escape. What followed was a chase that would haunt Thomas's dreams for years. Rain-slicked trails. The horse struggling with the travois. The children crying weakly as they were jolted about. Behind them, Cross's men gaining ground. The old trapper's path Thomas remembered from his early years in the territory was overgrown, treacherous. Twice the travois nearly overturned. Once, Samuel rolled partially out, and Thomas had to stop to secure him, losing precious ground. By full daylight, they'd reached the foothills. The rain had stopped. But fog rolled in, thick and concealing. Thomas used it, taking paths that would confuse pursuers, doubling back, laying false trails. At one point, voices came so close he could hear individual words. Thomas crouched beside the children, hand over the horse's muzzle, praying. Ruth chose that moment to cry out in her fever. The voices stopped, oriented, started moving toward them. Then, miraculously, a deer burst from cover nearby, crashing through the underbrush. The voices followed the sound, assuming it was their quarry. By afternoon, Thomas reached the line shack. It was barely more than a lean-to, but it was shelter. He carried the children inside, laid them on the rough cot, tried to get them to drink water. Both were dangerously hot now, lips cracked, eyes glazed. Please, he found himself praying, something he hadn't done since Sarah died. Not them. Take anything else, but not them. For 3 days, Thomas fought for their lives in that cramped shack. He bathed their faces with cool water from the stream, forced drops of water between their lips, held them when they shook with chills. He sang the old songs Sarah used to sing, told them stories, begged them to fight. On the second night, Samuel's fever broke. He opened his eyes, truly seeing Thomas for the first time in days. "Papa," he whispered, the word new and precious. Ruth held on longer, her small body battling something too big for it. Thomas dozed fitfully beside her, waking to check her breathing, terrified each time that it might have stopped. On the morning of the 4th day, she opened her eyes. The fever had broken. She was weak, terribly weak, but alive. Thomas wept then, great shuddering sobs that he'd held back for days. They'd survived, sick, homeless, hunted, but alive. Over the next week, the children slowly recovered. Thomas ventured out for food, rabbits, edible plants, once a deer that would feed them for days. He found a better shelter, a cave that was dry and defensible. Day by day, they grew stronger, but Thomas knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Winter was coming. The children needed proper food, warm clothes, medical care, and Cross's men would keep searching. 2 weeks after their flight, Thomas made a dangerous choice. He left the children hidden with most of his ammunition and all his prayers, and crept back toward the ranch. What he found stopped him cold. The house still stood, but damaged, windows broken, door hanging off its hinges. The barn was burned to the ground. His remaining cattle were gone, but there was also something else. Wagons in the yard, people moving about. Thomas recognized Doc Morrison's buggy, Miguel's wagon. Were they working with Cross? Then he saw Reverend Coleman nailing boards over a broken window. An understanding dawned. The town had come to save what they could. Thomas revealed himself carefully. The reunion was emotional. They'd feared him dead. The children lost. Marshal Brennan was there too, with federal papers. Cross overplayed his hand. The marshal explained. "Attacking your property, threatening children, those are federal crimes. We've been hunting him for 2 weeks. Did you catch him? 2 of his men..." Cross himself escaped. "But Tom, there's more. Thornton died in prison last week. Heart attack. They say his whole organization is in chaos. You can come home." Home. The word seemed foreign after weeks of running. "Is it safe?" "As safe as anywhere." Doc Morrison said, "Where are the children? Are they alive, recovering, hidden?" The journey back to retrieve Ruth and Samuel was tense. Thomas half expecting ambush at every turn, but they found the children where he'd left them, thin but resilient, playing with pine cones in the cave. The return to Willow Creek was triumphant and heartbreaking. The community had rallied again, starting repairs on the house, donating cattle to replace his lost herd. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. He'd nearly lost everything. That night, in their own beds for the first time in weeks, the children slept peacefully. Thomas sat between their cribs, rifle across his lap, unable to fully believe the danger had passed. A soft knock came at the door. James Worthington entered, his face showing the strain of the past weeks. "I've been searching everywhere," he said quietly. "When I heard what happened, He looked at his sleeping children. I should have been here. Should have protected them. You couldn't have known. I'm done with monthly visits, Worthington said suddenly. I'm moving to Willow Creek, opening a business here. I won't be a stranger in their lives anymore. Thomas studied the younger man, seeing new steel in his spine. They'd like that. As dawn broke, Thomas finally allowed himself to hope. They'd survived the worst: fever, flight. Men who saw his children as commodities. The house could be repaired, the herd rebuilt, the nightmares would fade. Ruth stirred, opening green eyes that were clear for the first time in weeks. She smiled at him, reaching out with one small hand. Papa, she said firmly. Home. Yes, little moon, Thomas whispered, taking her hand. We're home. The November snow fell thick and silent, muffling the sounds of approaching horses. Thomas had been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since word came that Jonathan Cross had been spotted in Denver, gathering men and supplies. The twins, now 2 years old, played by the fire, blissfully unaware that their world balanced on a knife's edge. Thomas had not been idle. The house was fortified, windows barricaded, shooting positions prepared, ammunition stocked. More importantly, he wasn't alone. James Worthington sat cleaning his rifle by the window. Miguel and his brothers had taken positions in what remained of the rebuilt barn. Doc Morrison waited with medical supplies. Even Mrs. Walsh's nephew, grown into a capable young man, watched from the roof. Riders coming, Worthington called softly. 8, maybe 10. Thomas moved to the window. Through the falling snow, he could see them, dark shapes against white, moving with military precision. Cross had learned from his previous failure. Take the children to the root cellar, Thomas told Mrs. Garcia, who'd insisted on being present. Bar the door from inside. Senor Tom, please, Maria, keep them safe. She gathered Ruth and Samuel, who protested being taken from their toys. We play hide-seek, she told them in her musical voice. Very quiet game. See, as the trapdoor closed behind them. Thomas checked his weapons one final time. The Henry rifle Sarah had given him for their last anniversary. The Colt at his hip. The shotgun by the door. The riders stopped just beyond effective rifle range. Thomas recognized Cross immediately, that aristocratic bearing unmistakable even through the snow. But it was the man beside him that made Thomas's blood run cold. Marcus Thornton. Impossible. Worthington breathed. He died in prison. Apparently not, Thomas said grimly. Thornton rode forward slightly, and Thomas could see the changes prison had wrought. Thinner, harder, with a tremor in his left hand and a scar across his throat, but very much alive. Mr. Garrett, Thornton called, his voice raspier than before. You've caused me considerable inconvenience. You're supposed to be dead. A useful fiction. Amazing what prison doctors will certify for the right price. Thornton shifted in his saddle. Shall we discuss terms? Nothing to discuss. Leave now, and you might make it back to Denver. Bold words for a man protecting 2 small children. Thornton's smile was a twisted thing. Oh yes, I know they're here, just as I know Mr. Worthington is with you, the failed father, finally trying to play hero. What do you want? Worthington called out. Justice, satisfaction, revenge. Thornton's voice hardened. You cost me everything. My business, my reputation, my health. Prison is unkind to men of my standing. Did you know they put me in with common criminals? That this, he touched his scarred throat, came from a man I'd foreclosed on years ago? You brought it on yourself, Thomas said. Perhaps, but now I'll return the favor. The children for your lives. Refuse, and we burn you out. Simple mathematics. Go to hell, Thornton sighed theatrically. I expected as much. Jonathan? Cross produced a torch. Already wrapped and ready. Others followed suit. Thomas counted 12 men total, all armed, all hard-faced. This wasn't a kidnapping party anymore. This was war. You burn us out. The children die too, Thomas pointed out. Acceptable losses. Thornton replied. "If I can't profit from them, I'll settle for knowing you failed to protect them, just as you failed your first family." The words hit like physical blows. Thomas forced his voice steady. "You've got 1 minute to leave." "Or what? You and your farmer friends will fight trained killers? Look around. Garrett, you're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options." A shot rang out. Cross's torch spun from his hand, extinguished in the snow. The crack of a Sharp's rifle echoed from the hills. "What?" Thornton spun, searching for the shooter. Another shot. One of Thornton's men cursed, clutching his shoulder. Then another, and another. Precision shots from multiple directions, never killing, always disabling weapons or wounding gun hands. "The hills are alive," Miguel called out with dark humor. "And they don't like child stealers." Thomas realized what was happening. The town had prepared for this. Hidden shooters in the hills, probably half of Willow Creek's best marksmen. Not close enough for a killing shot in this snow, but perfect for harassment, for preventing Thornton's men from organizing. "Inside," Thornton roared. "Take the house!" His men charged. Thomas and Worthington opened fire, Miguel and his brothers joining from the barn, the air filled with gun smoke and shouting. 2 of Thornton's men made it to the porch before Thomas dropped them with the shotgun. Another tried for the side window, only to meet Worthington's rifle. But there were too many, and they were professionals. "They're at the back," someone shouted. Thomas heard glass breaking, boots on floorboards. He fell back to the hallway, using the narrow space to his advantage. A man rounded the corner. Thomas shot him point blank. Another followed, stepping over his fallen comrade. Worthington caught him from behind. The battle raged room by room. Thomas had never fought in the war, but he imagined this was what it felt like. Chaos, smoke, the deafening roar of guns in enclosed spaces. "The cellar!" Cross's voice. "Somewhere in the house. Find the cellar!" Terror gave Thomas new strength. He bowled through 2 men, taking a grazing shot to the ribs but reaching the kitchen. Cross was there, prying at the cellar door with a crowbar. Thomas didn't hesitate. The Henry rifle bucked in his hands. Cross spun, clutching his thigh, the crowbar clattering away. But more men pushed in behind him. Then, suddenly, new gunfire from outside. Not the careful shots from the hills, but a concentrated volley. Shouts of alarm from Thornton's men, the thunder of many horses. "Federal marshals!" The voice boomed with authority. "Throw down your weapons!" Marshal Brennan had arrived with a full posse. The tide turned in moments. Thornton's men, caught between the house's defenders and federal authority, began to surrender. Thomas kept his gun on Cross, who lay bleeding on his kitchen floor. Through the window, he could see Thornton trying to flee, only to be ridden down by a marshal. "It's over," Thomas said. Cross laughed, a bitter sound. "You think this ends it? There's always another debt, another collector. Those children will never be safe." "Maybe not," Thomas admitted. "But they'll be loved. They'll be protected. They'll grow up knowing people fought for them, bled for them. That's more than you ever had." The cellar door opened cautiously. Mrs. Garcia peered out, the twins behind her. Samuel's eyes were wide with fear, but Ruth pushed past. Running to Thomas, "Papa hurt?" she asked, seeing the blood on his shirt. "Just a scratch. Little Moon." He scooped her up with his free arm, keeping the rifle trained on Cross with the other. "Just a scratch." The aftermath was swift. Thornton, the real Thornton this time, was taken into custody. His death had indeed been faked, part of an elaborate escape plan. Cross and the surviving men faced federal charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, assault on federal witnesses, as Thomas and the children were considered after testifying about the original loan sharking. Doc Morrison tended Thomas's wound, which was thankfully shallow. The house was damaged but standing. Most importantly, the children were unharmed. That evening, as federal marshals took statements and the town began to clean up, Thomas found himself on the porch with Worthington. The younger man had fought well, earning a new respect in Thomas's eyes. I've been thinking, Worthington said, about what Cross said, about there always being another threat. Man was trying to scare us. Maybe, but maybe he was right too. Worthington paused. I want to adopt them. Legally. Give them my name, my protection. A father with money and connections might deter future problems. Thomas stiffened. After everything, to lose them now. With you, Worthington added quickly. Joint custody. You're their papa, nothing changes that, but let me be their legal father too. Let me give them what I couldn't give Martha, security. Thomas considered this. Pride warred with practicality. But in the end, the children's welfare won. We'd need lawyers, papers. Judge Mason would have to approve. Already started the process. Worthington admitted. Josiah Bell drew up the documents. Just needs your signature. From inside came the sound of children's laughter. Ruth and Samuel, resilient as prairie grass, had already bounced back from their cellar adventure. Thomas thought of all the battles fought for them, all the people who'd stood between them and harm. All right, he said finally. But I have conditions. Name them. They grow up here, on this ranch. They learn to work cattle and mend fence alongside whatever fancy education you provide. They know their mother's story, all of it, not some sanitized version. And they understand that family isn't about blood or money or legal papers. It's about who shows up when the wolves come calling. Agreed. Worthington extended his hand. Partners. Partners. They shook on it. Two men who'd found common ground in protecting what mattered most. Inside. Ruth had climbed onto a chair, declaring herself the queen of something. Samuel attempted to join her, resulting in both tumbling onto the fortunately soft rug. Their laughter filled the bullet-scarred house with light. Thomas smiled. Let the wolves come. Let the creditors and kidnappers and all the darkness of the world try to touch these children. They'd find a united front, a rancher who'd chosen love over loneliness, a father who'd chosen courage over comfort, and a community that had decided some things were worth any fight. The November snow continued to fall, covering the signs of battle, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. By morning, it would look as if nothing had happened here, but Thomas knew better. Everything had happened here. A family had been forged in fire, tested by violence, and emerged stronger. The war for Ruth and Samuel Garrett Worthington was over. The task of raising them in peace could finally begin. Spring arrived gently that year, painting the Montana hills with wildflowers and warming the earth after the long, eventful winter. The courthouse in Willow Creek had been repaired and expanded, and today it hosted perhaps its most joyful proceeding. Thomas Garrett stood before Judge Mason in his best clothes, the suit he'd worn to marry Sarah 20 years ago, carefully preserved and only slightly tight around the shoulders. Beside him, James Worthington cut a finer figure in his Eastern tailoring, but both men's attention was on the two small figures between them, Ruth and Samuel, now 3 years old, fidgeted in their Sunday best, Ruth's dress, sewn by Mrs. Garcia with lace sent by their Aunt Constance, made her look like a tiny princess. Samuel kept tugging at his collar, clearly preferring his everyday overalls. This is a somewhat unusual arrangement, Judge Mason began, though his eyes twinkled with warmth. Joint adoption is rare, nearly unprecedented in our territory. But then again, this entire situation has been unprecedented from the start. The courtroom was packed. It seemed all of Willow Creek had come to witness this moment. Miguel and Maria Garcia with their 8 children. Doc Morrison looking older but satisfied. Mrs. Walsh dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Reverend Coleman ready to offer a blessing. Even Marshal Brennan had returned for the occasion. Mr. Garrett, the judge continued, you've raised these children since they were 3 days old. You've fed them, sheltered them, fought for them, nearly died for them. Do you wish to formally and legally claim them as your own? I do, Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. They've been mine since I picked them up at their mother's graveside. This just makes it official. And Mr. Worthington, You've acknowledged paternity and demonstrated commitment to their welfare. Do you wish to claim your parental rights and responsibilities? I do, James replied. I failed their mother, but I won't fail them. They'll have every advantage I can provide, while keeping the values Mr. Garrett has instilled. Judge Mason shuffled papers, then looked at the children. And what do you two think about all this? Ruth, never shy, piped up immediately. Papa is Papa and Father is Father, and we live at the ranch, and I'm learning to ride a big horse. Samuel, quieter like Thomas, simply reached up and grabbed both men's hands, one in each of his small fists. Well, Judge Mason smiled. I believe that settles it. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I hereby declare Ruth Martha Garrett Worthington and Samuel Thomas Garrett Worthington to be the legal children of both Thomas Garrett and James Worthington, with all rights and protections therein. The courtroom erupted in applause. Ruth, startled by the noise, climbed into Thomas's arms. Samuel stayed between his two fathers, beaming at the attention. After the legal proceedings came the celebration. The whole town gathered at the ranch, tables groaning with food. Miguel's fiddle joined by others for dancing. The house, so recently a battlefield, rang with music and laughter. Thomas found a quiet moment on the porch, watching the sun set over his land. The ranch had recovered from the winter's violence. The barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. The herd had grown. The bullet holes were patched and painted over, but more than the physical repairs, something fundamental had healed. Mind if I join you? James approached with 2 glasses of whiskey. Your whiskey. Thomas noted with a wry smile. Worthington had indeed opened a business in town, a general store that competed good-naturedly with Mrs. Walsh's establishment. They drank in companionable silence, watching Ruth chase Samuel around the yard, their laughter bright as bird song. She would have been proud, James said quietly. Martha, seeing them like this, she would have been proud of you too. Thomas replied, You've become a good man, James, a good father. I had a good teacher. As full dark approached, the party moved inside. Ruth had discovered she could sing, a clear, sweet voice that reminded everyone painfully and beautifully of her mother. Samuel showed off his counting skills, making it proudly to 20 before getting distracted by the cake misses. Walsh had baked later, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep. Thomas made his nightly rounds. It was habit now, checking locks, ensuring windows were secure, rifle loaded and ready. The threats were gone. Thornton serving a life sentence this time, Cross dead from his wounds. The criminal network scattered, but vigilance had become part of him. He paused at the children's room. They'd graduated from cribs to small beds, though they often ended up in the same one by morning. Tonight, they slept separately, exhausted from the day's excitement. Ruth clutched a doll Aunt Constance had sent. Samuel had his wooden horse, carved by Miguel, tucked under his arm. You did good, Tom. He turned to find Doc Morrison in the hallway, medical bag in hand. Thought they might need checking after all that cake, the doctor explained. But they look fine, better than fine. Thanks to you, to everyone. No, Doc's voice was firm. Thanks to you. You saved them. Tom, not just from the cemetery, but from becoming another tragic story of the frontier. You gave them what every child deserves, a chance. After Doc left, Thomas returned to the porch. The night was clear, stars sharp as glass in the Montana sky. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, but the sound no longer seemed threatening. It was just part of the landscape, like the wind in the grass or the creek running through the valley. He thought about the journey that had brought them here. A lonely rancher, afraid to love again. 2 abandoned infants, unwanted and unclaimed. A community that had learned to come together. A father who'd found his courage. And through it all, the simple truth that had carried them through every trial. Love didn't need blood or documents or social approval. It just needed someone willing to stay. Papa? Thomas turned to find Ruth in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. What is it? Little Moon? Bad dream, about the loud men. He scooped her up, settling her on his lap. The loud men are gone. Far away. They can't hurt you. Promise. Promise. She studied his face with those serious green eyes, then nodded, satisfied. Tell me about Mama. It was a common request. Thomas had become the keeper of Martha's memory, spinning stories from the few facts he knew and the love he could see in what she'd left behind. Your Mama was brave, he began. She came all this way to find a safe place for you and Samuel. She loved you so much that even when she was scared and alone, she kept going. Like you. The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? When the bad men came, you were scared, but you kept us safe. Yes, he said softly. Like that. Ruth yawned enormously. I'm glad you picked us, Papa. So am I. Little Moon, so am I. He carried her back to bed, tucking her in beside Samuel, who'd migrated to his sister's bed in her absence. They curled together like puppies, instantly peaceful. Thomas stood watching them for a long moment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Ruth was strong-willed and adventurous, always pushing boundaries. Samuel was quieter but deep-thinking, already showing signs of the stubbornness that would serve him well. They'd need guidance, patience, wisdom he wasn't sure he possessed, but they'd also have advantages he'd never dreamed of. Education from James, the rough skills of ranch life from him, a whole town that had claimed them as its own, the knowledge that they were wanted, fought for, chosen. As he headed to his own bed, Thomas caught sight of himself in the mirror. His hair had gone fully gray in the past 2 years, lines etched deep by worry and weather, but his eyes looked alive in a way they hadn't since Sarah died. The house settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs. Once, those sounds had emphasized his loneliness. Now they spoke of fullness, a home occupied by family, visited by friends, filled with purpose. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of spring rain. The ranch would prosper this year. The children would grow. Life would unfold as it should, not without challenges, but with the strength to meet them. Thomas Garrett, who had built walls around his heart, had learned the greatest truth of all. Sometimes the very thing we fear to lose is the only thing that can save us. Love was risk, always, but it was also redemption, healing, and hope in their small beds. Ruth and Samuel slept on, unaware of the philosophical musings of their papa. They knew only what mattered. They were home, they were safe, they were loved. And in the wild frontier of Montana, in a time when children could be bartered like cattle and family was often defined by convenience, that was nothing short of a miracle. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying the promise of tomorrow. And Thomas Garrett, father by choice, guardian by necessity, and family by love, finally allowed himself to believe in promises again. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Thomas, Ruth, and Samuel's journey. Your support means everything.